All right. Thank you guys for inviting me to come and talk with you today. I'm here to talk about the role of Walt Disney as a tool in U.S. foreign policy, and particularly how the U.S. government used Walt Disney Studios to support its interests in Latin America and the Caribbean on the eve of World War II. So I'm going to start off with kind of a question, which is what is soft power? So soft power is an idea that really doesn't emerge until the 1980s as like an analytical term, right? So for those of you who are taking international relations or political science, you'll have a lot of time talking about this. And the idea is that you can convince countries to do what you want simply by being a good role model, right? By having something that people want. So the definition from the Council on Foreign Relations is a country's ability to influence others without resorting to coercive pressure, right? You're not using sanctions, you're not using the military. You're actually encouraging them to follow you by projecting a good value or an idea. Right. This could also be like your development model. So a lot of countries right now look at China and say, wow, they've grown so quickly. That serves as a model that they want to replicate. So countries will follow and listen to them and have goodwill towards them because they want to have that same approach in the future. But the United States has used its power in pop culture to really shape foreign policy for a long time. And we call this public diplomacy. We've had goodwill tours. For those of you who don't listen to jazz, that's Louis Armstrong. Louis Armstrong was one of the early jazz ambassadors, and during the Cold War, the US government paid for him to go around and showcase the uniquely American music of jazz around the globe and to build goodwill towards Americans because everybody loves Louis Armstrong, right? He was such a huge star. Programs like this continue to exist. There's a hip hop diplomacy program that existed until recently, where we did the same thing with hip hop artists. We would send hip hop dancers, hip hop rappers, graffiti artists to different countries where they would work with youth in other cultural contexts and say, hey, this is what America is about. This is what we do. And up until 1999, we even had a group called the U.S. Information Agency that really ran a lot of these programs for the U.S. government. It was eliminated because the view was it was the end of the Cold War. We didn't have to compete to, win the hearts and minds of people anymore. But there's still a lot of debate within policy circles about whether or not that should be brought back. During World War II, I said this term comes out in the 1980s, but we've been doing this for a long time. And some of the earliest examples come out from what's called the Good Neighbor policy. And we'll talk about what that is in a minute. But during FDR's administration and the lead up to World War II, we established a group called the Coordinator for Inter-American Affairs, whose job it was to promote a Pan-American identity or this vision, right, that all of the countries of the Americas had a shared history and culture that people could look to. It was to counter Axis influence, right? There's the guy who started it was one of the Rockefellers, and he said he'd just gone to Mexico. He said, "Oh my God, the Nazis have so much influence in Mexico. We need to be concerned." So he came to Roosevelt and helped get this thing established to combat the growing Nazi influence in the region. But of all of the projects that they implemented, one of the most effective, according to their own documents, was actually their partnership with Walt Disney. It was referred to as one of the most effective in the field. Before it happened, people were comparing Walt Disney to the Mozart of America, that he was such a high level of artistry that this was something that the United States could showcase as its contribution to global culture. So what does the group do? The coordinator for Inter-American Affairs, he says, hey, we need to start reaching out. Some of the projects that they implemented were very effective, like the Walt Disney Project. Others were much less effective. They gave money to a lot of different, here, I'll switch into this next slide, but they gave money to a lot of different studios, some of which produced movies that were, how can I put this, culturally inappropriate. Films like, they were called things like a night in Argentina or a night in Buenos Aires, and then the entire movie takes place in Mexico, but they call it Buenos Aires. This resulted in protests in Argentina. Um, they had goodwill tours that they sponsored with famous movie stars of the time, where they basically got down there and either golfed or had affairs up and down the continent until they got in trouble and got kicked out. Um, That's part of why the Disney experience is so popular, was it does not do any of those things. But it also has a lot of elements that we can learn lessons from for today. So during the Good Neighbor policy, FDR comes to power. The Axis powers on the rise in Europe. The um, world economy is in shambles, right? We're talking about the Great Depression. And there's this desire to figure out a way to get out of all of these problems. And one of the ways that he does this, he says, look, we need to improve our relations with Latin America. We had been invading countries for a long time. We'd occupied several, including Nicaragua, for decades. Um, and the question was, how do we do this? So he said, all right, I'm going to drop trade barriers. We're going to work on conflict resolution. We're going to get out of these wars. And we're going to try to find a way to collaborate more meaningfully so that we don't have to have this conflict. I'm going to improve relations, not just between the government, but also between people. So a big piece of this was how do we build trade ties? How do we reduce German influence in the region? But also how do we get companies in the United States to actually want to invest in Latin America and the Caribbean so that we could get some of the trade flows going that would end the Great Depression. And here comes the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, established in 1940 and tasked with promoting this Pan-American identity. The idea that Latin America and the United States have a shared set of values and an identity. One thing that's really important about this is that a lot of these efforts were not just targeted at improving perceptions of the United States in Latin America, but also about improving perceptions of Latin America within the United States, right? If you want people to have better relations, it's really hard when people don't have a good impression of you. Um, and if you don't have a good impression of them, right? So there's this back and forth dialogue that was tried to create by the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs. Some of this was through what we would now call propaganda, right? At the time, they didn't have a difference between propaganda and goodwill tours or the soft power idea. It was all the same thing. Today, we would call some of this propaganda and some of it goodwill efforts. But part of it was about limiting this Nazi influence, and particularly in those countries that were viewed as becoming fascist: Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, or the EBC countries. A big piece of how they did this was through these goodwill tours. They sent artists, they sent musicians, they sent Orson Welles down to Latin America. He spent a long time in Brazil. His films never got produced. They sent Errol Flynn. Um, a lot of these things happened. And in October of 1940, so in that first year that they're established, they reach out to Walt Disney and say, hey, will you do a goodwill tour? It's a good time. There's a writer's strike going on. The studio is running out of money. And Walt Disney Studios says, absolutely, let's see what we can do. So they sign this initial contract and say, yes, we're going to do this goodwill tour of Latin America, of South America specifically, and we're going to produce 12 animated shorts, which will feature across 3 feature films. That isn't exactly what ends up happening because I'm sure you guys have all taken, world history at some point, and shortly after all of this begins, we are in World War II, and things change very, very rapidly. But we do see the production of a lot of content during this time. We do see the Goodwill Tour take place. We see 2 feature-length films that feature several shorts. The Saludos Amigos that was released in 1942 and The Three Caballeros in 1945. South of the Border with Disney, which is a documentary, kind of a documentary. It's a little bit of a travel log that has some pieces that were added in later. Um, and used some like stock footage to kind of create a telling of how their trip to Latin America and to Latin America went. A few we'll call these propaganda pieces designed at producing a real sense of Pan-American identity. One's called The Grain That Built the Hemisphere, which is this fascinating short about how corn connects the Americas, how everything about the hemisphere can be told through the story of corn. A kind of weird live action thing called The Amazon Awakens. Um, Donald sees South America, which is I don't have my copy with me. It's unfortunate, but it's a little book for kids where Donald Duck goes and travels across South America. And then in addition to these, there was such interest from the region that they produced a series of education and health films that were released in Latin America to promote public information on health through what was then called the Pan American Sanitation Bureau. Now it's called the Pan American Health Organization, which is part of the World Health Organization, and 4 education films that were about teaching people to read. Let's talk a little bit about what those two big films were. So the first one is Saludos Amigos, which was released in 1942, with the release actually taking place, the big grand opening of the film in Rio, which at the time was the capital of Brazil. Huge number of people visited. Um, it had a lot of dignitaries. I believe the Brazilian First Lady was actually in attendance for that grand opening. The film itself, if you guys haven't seen it, is a little weird. It's a mix of live action sequences about the trip, um, interspersed with four short animated features. One about Lake Titicaca, which is about Donald Duck visiting the land of the Incas. Lake Titicaca is on the border of Peru and Bolivia, um, and was chosen specifically so that they could, hit two countries with one piece. A film called Pedro, which is about a Chilean airplane that flies over the Andes Mountains to pick up the mail in Argentina and flies back. Gaucho Goofy, which features a cowboy version of Goofy pulled out of the wilderness of Texas and dropped into the pampas of Argentina so that they can show the similarities between the American cowboy and the Argentine gaucho. And the final number is this absolutely stunning animated piece called Aquarela do Brasil, in which Donald Duck is back. He meets a Brazilian parrot named José Carioca. Um, yes, it's Portuguese. The J is pronounced in the name. Um, and they take a tour of Rio through this animated adventure where everything is done in these bright watercolors. A few years later, they released The Three Caballeros, which was released once again abroad first in Mexico City. Um, Donald Duck, in this case, it's not done as a travelogue, but rather as Donald Duck receiving gifts from all of his Latin American cousins and all these other birds from across the region. And there's several short segments that are almost standalone short films within that. One's called The Cold-Blooded Penguin, which has a penguin from Antarctica kind of come up through Chile, up through past Lima, Peru, Ecuador, and eventually out to the Galapagos Islands. The Flying Gauchito, which is about a little boy in Uruguay who discovers a flying donkey while out condor hunting and decides to take him racing. Bahia, which has Jose Carioca return and go to another part of Brazil to learn about that part of Brazil. Um, and to chase women, which for those of you who've gone on the Disney ride for the Three Caballeros at Epcot, know that is a big part of why Donald Duck is in the region. Um, and then they go to Mexico for several numbers in which they first meet a Mexican rooster named Panchito. Um, and then they learn about Christmas or Las Posadas and those traditions, a tour of Mexico where they see live shots from across Mexico, and then a very surrealist set of numbers in which Mexican musicians perform alongside Donald Duck in these very like hallucinatory numbers. So kind of a weird thing. A lot of us, when we think about Disney, like the first like live action animated combination you think of as Mary Poppins, but really this was the film that kind of introduced that the first time around. Let's talk about some of the lessons, though, that were learned from this experience. The first was the goodwill tour and what really worked. The first thing to remember is Walt Disney did not just show up in the region, right? A lot of people who were involved in these goodwill tours, they didn't really do their homework. So they'd show up in country, let's say Brazil, and assume people spoke Spanish. Some of the other examples from the Good Neighbor policy include companies in different parts of the United States emailing the coordinator for Inter-American Affairs and be like, do they have windows in Brazil? Walt Disney actually did his homework and checked to see what was going on in the region beforehand. They had different academics come and talk about what was going on. They had people from Pan Am Airlines come in and talk about like what they saw in the region. Um, and they started to do their homework even on like Latin American art with the idea that they wanted to have some idea of what they were going to learn while they were there. The trip covers several different countries. The big ones that they spend the most time in are Brazil and Argentina. There's a day trip out to Uruguay, and then a little bit of time in Chile before heading home. For the most part, some of the group travels up into Peru. But for the most part, they spend the bulk of their time in Brazil and Argentina. Once again, those ABC countries that they were most interested in. They don't just meet with diplomats. They actually take this as a excuse. One, they say we're not here with, they don't tell people they're there paid by the US government. They go in and they say, hey, we're here as artists. We're going to show Fantasia. We're going to do kind of the grand premiere of Fantasia in different cities. Um, and then we're going to meet with local comic or local animator clubs. We're going to meet with youth. We're going to meet with professionals and different political elite, but we also want to learn about the country. So they would go to the Botanic Gardens in Brazil. They would go and explore tango and big gaucho barbecues in Argentina. And they learned a lot about while they were there. It also helps that while they were there, not only were they there being very, very kind of approachable to different groups within society, the news that was coming out at the same time about what the Germans were up to did not look good. So the newspaper right there that says "Welcome, Walt," um, was about them kicking. They had just captured a Nazi spy ring, and or not a Nazi spy ring, but a group of Nazi politicians that were trying to influence the government. And they kicked them out of the country. So that was the headline that day, is this great sign about how the United States has Walt Disney as their ambassador in the country, and then the Germans messing around and they should be kicked out of the country. All of this is to say that how these goodwill tours work and who you approach really does send a clear signal. In terms of strengthening Pan American identity, a lot of the work that was done was based on trying to create parallels between the United States and Latin America and the Caribbean. Probably the most obvious is the fact that there are three anthropomorphic birds that represent different countries in the region. Donald Duck representing the United States, Jose Carioca representing Brazil, and Panchito representing Mexico. One of the so-called lost caballero was actually supposed to be another rooster that was going to represent Cuba. And if you look online, you can find some sketches of him that were supposed to be used in what would have been the third of the Good Neighbor policy films. I mentioned before the grain that built the hemisphere, this idea that corn connects the region. And Gaucho Goofy does this exact same thing where they showcase the similarities between different countries. Basically by taking one person, Goofy, out of the United States and comparing him to the Gauchos in Argentina by having him be the brunt of the jokes. This is also extremely effective, right? You don't want to make fun of countries when you're trying to build good relations with them. So what do? We don't make fun of, have a Argentine character that's kind of bumbling around. We take the American character of Goofy, make him go and hit himself in the head with bolas while trying to hunt ostriches on the pampas of Argentina. Another thing that was really important was that there was a clear recognition of national differentiation between the different countries, right? For a lot of us in the United States, when we look to Latin America and the Caribbean, people think, oh, it's all the same country. But there's a lot of differentiation, and the Disney experience really did try to highlight some of those differences between countries. There's cases where they kind of moved between those, like they said with the Lake Titicaca short, where they said, hey, we're in the land of the Incas and kind of merged a couple of countries, but they were still very careful to highlight the similarities and differences across countries. Um, I used this graphic because I think it's absolutely fascinating. One of the success stories that comes out of the Good Neighbor policy is that Brazil actually sends troops to fight in the European theater during World War II. And Walt Disney designs their logo, right? If you go and look up like the World War II era logos that Disney designed, there's a ton of them. But one of them is Walt Disney designed the one for the Brazilians, which were called the Smoking Cobras, hence the gun-slinging snake with a pipe sticking out of his mouth. Another thing that was really important about this that clearly made it work better than a lot of the other examples was that they ensured that they had local collaboration. Artists from across the region, music from across the region were incorporated into the stories that they told. Gaucho Goofy, a lot of the backgrounds are actually done and inspired by a Argentine artist who did paintings of gauchos. The music from Brazil, each of them has a samba tune that was popular at the time when they went down, and they worked with local artists to produce all of that content. They also had government collaborators. They made sure that what they were doing was something that the government wanted to see, right? One of the we'll get into this in the critiques. One of the critiques is that in the segment on Bahia in Three Caballeros, it's a very white crowd. There are no Afro-Brazilians in the piece. That was part of what the government wanted to portray in their portrayal of Bahia, and both the U.S. government and Walt Disney Studios agreed that that would be a way for them to help the Brazilian government put the message that they wanted to out. The other thing that's really important is audience targeting. Um, these films were not, I mentioned that they were originally premiered in Brazil and in Mexico City, but originally these films were not designed for Latin American audiences. They were actually designed to showcase to US audiences what Latin America was and build popularity for Latin America amongst US audiences. It wasn't until a Bolivian diplomat watched the film with Rockefeller, who was that coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, and said, "Oh my God, these are amazing. You should make sure that these are seen in Latin America," that they decided to really push it and have these films become a tool for foreign policy in those countries. So what didn't work? Several things. First is there's a lot of arguments about neo-imperialism within the Disney products in general. Um, the pit helmet that Donald Duck is wearing is kind of the classic example of neo-imperialism. Donald Duck comics in particular have been highlighted as strengthening neo-imperial designs in the region, less so than the two than these films specifically, but the comics themselves. Um, and it's created a lot of backlash within certain segments of society. It also does rely on certain stereotypes. The stereotype at the time of Mexico was a gun-toting, it was Pancho Villa coming across the U.S. border, having Panchito Pistoles, which became his nickname later on, be the character what could be viewed as being problematic. At the time, it was not viewed as terribly problematic, but in hindsight, people are like, "Oh my God, that was really, really bad." Um, the over-sexualization of Latin America as a whole. Um, Across both films, Donald Duck is trying to woo Latin American women across the region, and that was something that, once again, in hindsight, people have highlighted as a real issue. And finally, probably the biggest problem for why this program worked or didn't is its longevity, right? The Good Neighbor policy starts in the 1930s and ends with the end of World War II. It doesn't last very long. So, as far as building lasting impact, it's hard to say how much these things could have done had we allowed them to run for a longer period of time. All right, that's in a nutshell what happens with those films. I want to talk a little bit about Disney in Latin America post the Good Neighbor era because I think it's important to look at. The first is the Three Caballeros have not disappeared. They continue to be used in various Disney products. There's a short in Melody Time called Blame It on the Samba, in which Donald Duck and Jose Carioca return and have a samba number together. In Walt Disney's Wonderful World of Color, there's two episodes, I believe, that feature, once again, Jose Carioca coming back. One of them is this absolutely fascinating number where they actually compare um, Mardi Gras in New Orleans and Carnival in Rio de Janeiro, and Donald Duck and Jose Carioca play against each other as reporters, highlighting what's going on in those two different celebrations. Um, House of Mouse had a couple of episodes that featured the Three Caballeros. Several of the Disney Junior shows have since brought them back. Um, the Mickey Mouse shorts from 2013, there were several of them where they made appearances, more where Jose Carioca would actually make an appearance in the Brazilian numbers. There's two or three episodes in the DuckTales from 2017. And then there was a short series called The Legend of the Three Caballeros, which has absolutely nothing to do with where they're from, and instead is this kind of mythical adventure where they go around. Across the comics, the Three Caballeros have also made several appearances. There was an entire comic book series devoted to Jose Carioca in Brazil. Um, I should have brought this with me as well. There's even a history of soccer um, that features Donald Duck and Jose Carioca talking about what that looks like that was printed in Brazil. And then there's a couple of the Don Rosa comics that also featured the Three Caballeros. I think it's two or three. And then the Disney parks, there's It's a Small World in Disneyland. The original one actually did have the Three Caballeros, sponsored by UNICEF, highlighting kind of that history of trying to showcase the parallels across the region. Disneyland Japan is super interested in the Three Caballeros. I'm not entirely sure why that is, but it's just an interesting fact. And then at Epcot, there's the Grand Fiesta Tour. Um, One thing I will just highlight about all of these that's very different and stands out in a lot of ways is that most of these products, with the exception of It's a Small World and maybe the Epcot ride, and definitely the Wonderful World of Color ones are less based on showcasing and building that good neighbor policy message, right? They weren't about developing these messages of Pan-American unity. In fact, there's a couple of lessons that they dropped. Most of them stopped calling Jose Carioca Jose and switched it to Jose. So he's now no longer given the Brazilian pronunciation of his name. Um, but there is an effort, I think, to understand what these characters could have been. I wanted to highlight this because I think this is absolutely fascinating. Is with the growth of Brazil in the early 2000s through the 2010s, their economy took off. And as part of that, there was a huge influx of Brazilians who came to Disney World every year. Um, According to flight records, Brazilians are like the number one group to fly into Orlando Airport, and a large number of them do go to Disney World. The numbers, in fact, were so great that for several years there was a group called the Super Greeters that would be available to help Brazilian tourists at Disney World during those peak seasons. And these were young Brazilians who were obviously spoke Portuguese. They wore green shirts with a Brazilian flag on them and were there to help because there weren't enough Portuguese speakers to help out with all of that. I also showed this pin because I think it's really interesting. This is from last year, I believe. I'm sorry, from 2024. For Hispanic Heritage Month, they actually brought back the Three Caballeros as a pin for their artists collection. And it was done by a Brazilian artist, was who designed that pin. Disney has also gone back to Latin America a few times in different feature films. One of them was Coco. There was some controversy around this when Disney tried to trademark Day of the Dead. They did end up withdrawing that trademark request, but it did create a little bit of tension for the studios. That said, not that much. When this movie came out, it was the highest grossing film of all time. It remains one of the it remains extremely popular in Mexico, and has not been, and has been viewed as kind of a real piece of artistry. Part of this, though, is going back to those examples from the Three Caballeros. They had a cultural consultant who came in and said, look, this is what Mexican culture is. This is what the pieces that you should be highlighting. And that's an important element in making sure that these films are extremely successful. Likewise, we see some of the lessons from that Three Caballeros experience brought into Encanto, which takes place in Colombia. Um, Arguably, one of the most important pieces and lessons of this is once again the use of local artists that were brought in. So that song Colombia is sung by an artist named Carlos Vives, who is a huge Colombian musician. Once again, the movie was very popular in Colombia. If you look at these light shows that I have up there, those are from Medellin, which is one of the largest Christmas light shows in the world. And the year that this came out, Encanto was the topic of or was the theme for that year's Christmas show. They've got a huge Christmas park that was all decked out with the different rooms, the Encanto house, obviously, the different doors. It was a huge tourist attraction that year. There's some important lessons, I think, though, that we can draw from this for the future. One is that, and Joseph and I were talking about this a little bit at the beginning, there are some lessons that can be learned about what we could do to improve the use of cultural diplomacy by the US government or by other actors. One is that we can learn to build upon private success, right? The success of Disney in negotiating and being part of these goodwill tours was that he was already popular, right? He had quote unquote brand recognition, right? That you could use to generate high visibility and high interest in what you're doing. He also didn't want to be affiliated with the US government because some of those past bad looking goodwill tours, which produces some plausible deniability about what the US government's doing, right? So if you want to increase your influence, you have an artist show up, you can say that they're there on their own, even if they're being or receiving sponsorship from the government. Number two, do your research. This is true for all of you, where if you ever travel abroad, make sure you know a little bit about where you're going. Um, this is something that was clear in the Disney example, was that they'd actually done the research before they got to where they were going, so they didn't just not know what was going on. Work with locals. Um, Cultural diplomacy works best not when you're just showcasing the expertise of your country, but when it's a dialogue between cultures. By working with local artists, by meeting with local artists, Disney had a lot more success than he would have. Positive images, right? When we're talking about Latin America, probably the most popular current example of kind of a successful Latin American portrayal in US media is Narcos. That's not a very good look for countries that are being showcased in those films. If you want to have a net positive impact on kind of the relationship with countries, it's good to show a positive image. People want to see positive images. At the same time, feel free to make fun of yourself, right? The brunt of all of the jokes across these films are Donald Duck and Goofy. They're popular. They're already kind of slapstick characters. Let them be the brunt of the jokes, and that's something that can help improve the relations more broadly. And then highlight similarities. Characters, people feel better when they know that there's similarities between countries, right? Don't just spend time showcasing where people are different, but also showcasing how much people can be the same. I'm going to go ahead and open the floor for questions. I'll turn off the recording as well. So just give me 1 second here.